Hello and welcome to episode number 614 of Smart Podcast Trashy Books. I'm Sarah Wendell and my guest today is Harper St. George. We are going to talk about Harper's new book, The Stranger I Wed, which has a truly gorgeous cover. Like, it's sumptuous. And we're going to talk about dollar princesses of the Gilded Age, which is a really fun piece of history. We talk about transactional marriages and the power dynamics of marriage of convenience. Plus, Harper has a few recommendations from her favorites. I will have links to everything we talk about in this episode in the show notes at smartbitchestrashybooks.com/podcast under episode 614. I want to say hello and thank you to our Patreon community, as I always do at the start of every episode, because every episode is made possible with your support. Thank you. Hi, Leah. You are the newest member. Welcome. I hope you're enjoying the absolute zany warmth of our Discord. Podcast Patreon members get bonus episodes. As I mentioned, we have a Discord, and there are a lot of extras, like you get the full PDF scan of every Romantic Times issue that I scan with my scanner, which is hopefully permanently parked right next to me now. Most importantly, the Patreon support keeps the podcast going every week and makes sure that every episode is transcribed by Garlic Knitter. If you would like to join the Patreon, it would be awesome if you did. Have a look at patreon.com/smartbitches. Support for this episode comes from Lumi Deodorant. Lumi is a game-changing whole-body deodorant powered by mandelic acid to control odor everywhere. It was developed and designed by an OBGYN, and it delivers outrageous 72-hour odor control. And they've got over 300,000 five-star reviews from very happy customers who feel very confident indeed. We have a special offer. New customers get 15% off all Lumi products with our exclusive code and link. Use code SARAH15 at LumiDeodorant.com. That's LumiDeodorant.com. The thing I like about Lumi the most is that I don't have to think about it when I'm done thinking about it. I put it on, it works, and I stop thinking about it. Even when it's 90 degrees out, all of a sudden, what is with that? My teenager, who ran off with most of my Lumi starter pack items, also really likes Lumi and carries it around in his backpack, especially now that there's gym class and it's 90 degrees. So unfair. Lumi's starter pack is perfect for new customers. It comes with a solid stick deodorant, cream tube deodorant, and 2 free products of your choice, like a mini body wash and deodorant wipes, and free shipping, so that when your teen steals all your products, you know what you would have had. As a special offer for listeners, new customers get 15% off all Lumi products with our exclusive code. And if you combine the 15% off with the already discounted starter pack, that equals over 40% off your starter pack. And the products in the starter pack last a long time. Use code SARAH15 for 15% off your first purchase at LumiDeodorant.com. That's code SARAH15 at LumiDeodorant.com. Thank you to Lumi Deodorant for supporting this episode, and thank you for supporting our advertisers. All right, are you ready to start this podcast? Let's talk about history, dollar princesses, and transactional marriages with Harper St. George.
I'm Harper St. George, and I write historical romance. Right now, I'm writing Gilded Age historical romance, but I've written Vikings and historical westerns, and even co-wrote a contemporary sports romance. So I'm sort of all over the place.
I mean, when in doubt, switch genres, right?
Exactly. That's been my theory.
Are you bored? Try another place.
Exactly, yes.
I'm looking forward to the time-traveling Vikings in the Gilded Age. Because one of the things, as you know, I've been doing with the podcast is looking at old issues of Romantic Times. And so for May, we are going back to May, I think it's May 1994. And when there are so many time travel romances in that issue, I was like, oh, I forgot this was a whole thing.
It was big. I think Outlander kicked off a lot, because wasn't that around 1990? Isn't that when that came out?
Yep.
Somewhere around in there?
Somewhere in there.
And then there were a lot of time travel romance. I can remember because I was in high school when I really got into romance.
Yeah, me too.
That was in the mid-90s.
Yep.
And I can remember being, okay, I don't want to read another time travel romance.
Sorry, that's all there is.
Anyway.
Thank you, first of all, for The Stranger I Wed. I had Bad Decisions Book Club last night reading it. It was a big problem. I'm a little drowsy. So I'm A, going to yawn, and B, wow, that was fun. What a fun book. Beyond the truly gorgeous cover. Like, did you see the cover and have to put your head between your knees?
Yeah, I I have been so thankful for all of my covers with Berkeley. They've all been amazing. And I did not know what to expect with this being a new series, the direction they would go. Beyond, I was like, please put a pretty dress on the cover.
Honestly.
It was amazing.
And the way that the cover incorporates embroidery is so beautiful and also very period appropriate, considering that one of the ways you would demonstrate your wealth and your assets was the embellishment of your clothing.
Right. Yeah. I loved it so much, and I was so excited to see that. And the gold.
Oh, a lot of gold. So what will readers find inside this book?
Okay, well, it is a marriage of convenience. So this is a spin-off series from my last series. So you're going to have the Gilded Age heiresses, again, the same theme, but just a different set in that this is a group of sisters, 3 sisters, and they're illegitimate. And their father is Charles Hathaway. But when I say Hathaway, you can kind of substitute Astor because that's sort of what they're based on. So this old New York family, and he had a mistress who he was planning to marry, but his parents stepped in and said no. So now he has this family, and he has his real family because he's married now. And he sort of wants to get them away so they don't ruin the marriage prospects of his actual daughter, his legitimate daughter. So they have to go to England to marry and inherit their dowry, which is a condition of that's releasing the dowry. And Leo is the Cora's husband to be. He's an earl in need of money. He's a little different of a hero for me because while I love writing rakes and I love reading rakes, I was looking for a change, and his character just sort of came to me in bits and pieces. And he's very much the sort of person that needs to have the emotional connection before he can develop sexual attraction. So that's also contributes to the slow burn a little bit because they really have to get to know each other. They have to start supporting each other before that part of their relationship develops.
So he has some traits of demisexuality, even though obviously they wouldn't call it at that time, that there has to be an emotional foundation before sexual attraction.
Exactly.
I noticed that, but didn't want to label it such because obviously that language didn't exist at that time. But I noticed that attribute to his character. I also love that he and Cora are both aware of the world that they're in, and they're politically minded in different ways. For the record, I don't like to spoil books that I'm talking about, so I'm going to be real vague at some point. So I don't want to spoil anything to somebody who's listening and hasn't read the book yet. But they're both very politically minded. That was a really interesting choice because, again, usually you have heroes who are like, I would like to drink and gamble and have sex. These are my jobs.
It's true. Yeah. Well, I love to research what's going on in the world of my heroes and heroines. So, and even now with the world we live in, it's really difficult for me to imagine people who are not, even if they're not politically involved, at least aware and opinionated somewhat of what's going on around us and around them. One thing that really drew me to this era is how it mirrors where we're at a little bit.
A lot.
And the political aspects, because you have the women's rights movement, you have the workers' rights, because unions weren't really a thing, but they were starting. You had the Jim Crow law starting. So you had, people of color looking for equal rights. And you have all of that happening or starting at least in the 1870s, which is when this book takes place. And, we see that even now, how we're still sort of fighting, not exactly the same. We have made progress. I don't want to say we haven't, but you still see those echoes now.
And you also see this enormous amount of wealth consolidated within a very small amount of people. That's true now, and that was true then.
Exactly.
And they are both and they're both very resistant to union organization, labor movements, women's rights, like all of the structures that feed, capitalism and white supremacy. They're very in favor of those structures. They don't want to see them come down because that eradicates their power.
Right. And they're doing everything they can to pass laws that are going to hold those systems in place.
Yeah. Wow. Nothing changes. How bleak.
I know. It just, it keeps coming back around. The more things change, the more they stay the same in a lot of ways because one of my pet peeves about history is when people now will say, well, back in my day, we didn't do X, Y, or Z, or the world these days. And it's like, people are the same. We have the same selfishness. We have the same desires.
Yep.
There are good things too, but it just keeps coming back around. And in many ways, we have to learn these lessons again over and over.
Yeah. Now, can I ask about Cora? I'm curious if she was inspired by any specific dollar princesses.
Cora, no, pretty much she was just sort of an amalgamation of all of these women that I had heard of. I can say not necessarily her, but the situation of all of her and her sisters being illegitimate and being married off to wealthy or titled men. Was inspired because I wondered, I just got to wondering, could that actually happen? Would they have to be legitimate for it to work? And so I did come across Almina Wombwell.
Yeah.
She was actually British, and her father was a wealthy industrialist, one of the wealthiest families in England. And her mom was married to, I think he was a Navy captain. So he was like her father, but not her biological father. And then she was married to the Earl. I can't remember it, Carnarvon or something like that.
Yep.
Anyway,
just pulled it up because I love this particular example of I mean, she wasn't technically a dollar princess because she was British, but the idea that she was illegitimate and was like, nope, got me a crown, got me a big old robe, things are good. Yeah, it was Carnarvon.
And she became Countess of Highclere Castle, and that's the Downton Abbey house.
I know.
So it's such a good little piece of history. So, it definitely did happen.
And like you just said, it does come back around.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, I know that you write, obviously, in the Gilded Age, which is very awesome. And I would really like to give you the opportunity to show off some of your favorite pieces of research. A lot of people know about, Victorian society. The Gilded Age is now receiving a lot more attention in popular culture, which excellent timing for your books. Fantastic. It's really great when pop culture and a book publication line up. Like I did a couple of interviews with Maggie Takuta Hall, and she released The Mermaid, the Witch, and the Sea. And then Our Flag Means Death became popular. And she's like, okay, so if you like queer pirates, I have books. I'll get them right now. And the second book hit at that perfect moment. And so I love it watching when popular culture and the books that I love, they meet up and everyone's like, oh, wait, there's all of this. And I'm like, yes, there's all of this. Come to romance. We have neat shit. So yeah, such great stuff. And it's so great when the popular culture and the thing that you write are starting to intersect and become popular at the same time.
Because so often that does not happen.
No, it's so rare. And so when it does, it's like, yes, this is great. Ride the wave. What are some of the things about the Gilded Age that you love writing about? And what are some differences between the Gilded Age and the Victorians?
Okay, the one thing I love about the Gilded Age is just the over-the-top opulence of it. I mean, it's really crass and bold.
Oh my gosh, because they didn't have social media. They could have the most ridiculous parties and only people would start to gossip about it. Well, it was 4 days ago. What are you going to do?
I know. They could spend $1 million on a party and people would talk about that for, a year. And it would be in all the newspapers across the land because what else are they going to talk about?
And that happens again. If you look at Truman Capote and his black and white ball, there's a whole show about this one party.
I know. So I would never live like that because it's just, I like to spend too much time reading than planning parties.
Yeah.
But it's so fun to visit that mentality and what that would have been like. And you have elephants come to your party and you have,
as you do,
tables set up with swans floating down the tabletop. And it's just amazing what they would come up with to outdo each other. So that's one of my favorite things. I am not a gossiper. I'm like one of these people. I don't spill the tea, but I very much love to listen to it.
Yes.
So it's a little bit like, okay, so what is Alva Vanderbilt up this week?
Yep.
So it's very interesting, just the gossip and all the craziness that happens.
Oh, there's so much too.
Yeah.
Because when you're that
It's never
worried
ending.
about appearances in front of your peers, you're going to constantly talk about them as well.
Exactly.
And of course, you're going to write it down and send it in letters, and hopefully some of them survive. Uh-oh.
And, you have to be talked about in some ways to survive in this sort of society. Because if you're the quiet little mouse or the wallflower,
No.
why would anyone care about you?
And that's a difficult tension, I think, for Cora and her sisters, because they have to make enough of a splash that they can get the attention of a titled person, and that would release the terms of their money. I don't think that's a spoiler because it happens in like the first 5 pages. Also, her father is a complete tool. Like, I kept highlighting things he was saying. I'm like, oh, this guy, I know this guy. Like, he's like, well,
you know him, right?
I know him. I was like, oh, you're just the worst. He's like, well, I wanted to wait until the dust settled before I told you and your sisters about this life-changing amount of money that my mom left you. Bro, if she had not shown up in your house and said, what's going on? Because I got a letter, he wasn't going to say a word.
He totally wouldn't have said a word.
What a putz. Anyway, that guy.
That sort of brings up the differences, I think, in the British Victorian Society.
Oh, really?
And the Gilded Age Society in the U.S., at least in New York. When I say Gilded Age, I really think it applied pretty much all over the Western world outside of England. But my focus is obviously on the New York. So it's interesting in that these women would have had, and they did have an easier time going to Britain or anywhere in Europe, really, to catch a titled husband than they would have being upwardly mobile in the United States.
Yeah.
And it's because probably most of you know if you're into Gilded Age, but, at that point in British history, the aristocracy were sort of losing their money. Many of them were sinking into genteel poverty because of the Industrial Revolution. Their tenant farmers were moving to the cities. Their farms were staying bare. You could at that point import grain cheaper than you could buy it in the English countryside. So that allowed a lot of room for these women who had this money behind them to come in and snag a titled husband. But they could not necessarily move upward in U.S. society because U.S. society was all about keeping the new money people out, almost no matter who you were. Now, we do see examples of some of the men and the sons marrying upward, like Caroline Astor, her daughter Carrie Astor, married a new money a guy from a new money family. The Marion Wilsons was the name of that family, and there's a lot of fun stories there. But essentially, she went on a hunger strike until her mom relented and let her marry him. And you do see other instances of this, and it's because the men would inherit the money and the political power, so they were able to offer something to these families that the women weren't necessarily able to offer. The daughters of these families had only the money their family gave them. They didn't really have influence.
No.
So it was easier for them to move to England.
Yeah.
And in England, you were not seeing the men being upwardly mobile that much because,
they were all locked into position.
Yeah. Exactly. So in some ways, it was easier for them to crisscross that way.
Yeah.
The men to come over here, the women to go over there.
And also you have a lack of a firm language barrier. There's definitely terms and differences in words, but for the most part, you can understand each other. It's not like a language barrier between, like, say, France and England, where if you don't speak French, you're kind of in trouble. There's not as much of a language barrier, but there's enough of a distance barrier that it's going to take some effort to find out if someone really is who they say they are. And if the check clears, does it actually matter if they are who they say they are?
I don't think it does, really, because once you're a countess, once you're a duchess, they kind of have to invite you to the party.
Yeah.
You're not going to be, they're going to talk about you regardless, I think. And I think a lot of these women who did make that move and they would be sent to these country estates that didn't have good plumbing. They certainly didn't have electricity.
I want to ask you about that because that's one of my favorite things about the dollar princesses.
And they're just sitting in these, dank old castles. And it's like, well, now what? I had a better life back in New York.
Yep. When you mentioned the upward mobility, one of my favorite stories when I was growing up, I grew up in Pittsburgh, which is where the Frick and the Mellon families were. And I grew up down the street from the home of the Frick family, which is Clayton. And until I was really young, Henry Clay Frick's daughter, Helen, lived there. And like it used to be a dare for us to go trick-or-treating at Clayton House because it was big and gothic and scary. And you go up this big driveway. She actually would sometimes answer the door, but she was elderly. But I once did a tour of the Frick estate. Once she died, she gave Clayton to the city and they refurbished it. Now it's a museum connected to the museum. And there's also the carriage house. And so the story is that the carriage house is really opulent. Like it looks like one of those big New York mansions. And the reason is that Henry Clay Frick and his wife Adelaide went to New York. And of course, he's got money and he's friends with Andrew Carnegie and the Mellons. So they let him into things, but the society wives were really unkind to Adelaide. And so she went back home to Pittsburgh and designed the stable to look like the home of the woman who had snubbed her, because that was going to be where all her horses took a dump, inside that woman's house.
Wow.
Isn't that glorious petty?
Amazing.
I love that kind of petty. Like that's planned petty. But you can also
amazing.
But I can also understand you have this money, you have more money than you could possibly spend in your lifetime, but what you want in terms of social acceptance is forbidden to you. And then you have to go through all these weird hoops to get it. And even then, if you are a countess, there's going to be people who are rude to you. You just have to learn how to be rude back in effective ways. Now, speaking of the dollar princess, isn't that terrible?
Yes, it
terrible,
is.
petty. I love it so much. Now, that was from a tour guide. I can't 100% verify that, but that was.
I'm going to have to research that.
If it shows up in a book, I'm extremely excited that it would show up in a book. This was told to me by a tour guide at the Frick estate, which is Clayton. I want to ask you about the dollar princesses, because I find this whole concept so fascinating.
In all, there were about 350 of these marriages. So.
Which is a big number.
It's not surprising.
But also not a big number that they made such a splash.
Yeah. Well, some people put it all the way up to World War I. I would say it kind of ended in the early 1900s, because then we get into the progressive era, I think, more than the Gilded Age.
Mm-hmm.
But if you count all the way, that's like a good 40 years.
Yeah. Yeah. And
I know that newspapers at the time, even in the late 1870s, early 1880s, were sort of lamenting the fact that all of these women were going to Europe to find husbands when we had good men in America who needed wives.
Yeah, they're missing a key element of the plot there. There's one video that I was watching to prep for this interview, and the narrator said something along the lines of, well, when you've run out of things to buy to show how powerful you are, and you've already got a yacht, and you already got jewelry, and you already throw parties, and you got 5 houses, what do you need? You need a title. But we don't have those over here, so we're just going to go over there and get some.
Exactly. It was cash for class marriages. That's what they were calling them in the newspaper. That's totally what it was. Personally, I feel like at that point, you should maybe start giving your money away. You can buy a title too.
Makes me think of Mackenzie Bezos, Jeff Bezos' ex-wife, who keeps giving away buckets and buckets and buckets of money. Yeah. I'm like, go ahead, girl. This is great. Love it.
Yeah.
I also love the fact that all of these American heiresses who were raised in newer homes with the latest modern conveniences, like you said, would go out to this country pile and be like, you have holes in your roof. There is no plumbing. Why do you not have heat? This is what is this? So then you have these people, right? And you have these people who society probably doesn't want to welcome them, but not only do they bring money, and not only are they married in so you can't get rid of them, they're bringing you indoor plumbing. Mm-hmm. Let them in.
Let them in. Yeah. I read somewhere that in today's dollars, they infused $1 billion into the British economy.
Holy cow.
Which, as you can imagine, would sorely have been needed.
Yeah.
And yet they're being, I'm sure, talked about at all these parties, and they're not they're not blue-blooded enough. No, I do not envy them.
No, I don't either. Really
What they
don't
would have
either.
had to overcome.
I have to say, looking at it objectively as a romance fan, I really love marriage of convenience stories. And transactional marriages, I think, are a very particular flavor of marriage of convenience. And one of the things I like about Leo and Cora is that they're very open about the transaction that they are making. Like it's in like chapter 3. All right, so I have money. Here is the letter with all of the money that I am going to bring to this marriage. And I love when he reads it. He's like, he can't school his features fast enough. He's like, holy shit. Oh my God, that's a lot of zeros. Oh boy.
That's enough money.
That's amazing. Oh, all I have to do is marry you. Wow. Okay. And you're passively attractive and intelligent. Whoa. He's really floored. But they're very open about what the terms of their marriage are. And the thing I love about marriage of convenience is that it separates marriage from intimacy. Because often in romance, obviously, where the intimacy leads to marriage. Sometimes you were too intimate, got caught, and you have to get married. But the intimacy leads to marriage. That's like the end goal. Whereas with a marriage of convenience, rather than intimacy leading to marriage, with marriage of convenience, the marriage leads to the intimacy, which is what happens with Cora.
And you have that forced proximity sort of built right in, right?
There's literally only one bed. There's only one bed because you're already married. So why do you like marriage of convenience stories? What are your favorite things about them?
Well, I have to say, I've always loved the enemies to lovers stories and where they're adversarial to start with. I do love marriage of convenience because of the forced proximity, but it's never been one of my top favorites. And I never have set out to write a marriage of convenience until this book.
Yeah.
Because I like to challenge myself and do different things. I mean, sort of like with Leo's character in general and with the marriage of convenience. I love how you have these two strangers who have no idea if they're well suited or not. And they have to come together and make it work. And I love seeing them sort of butt heads or brush up against each other in intention and not actually, and just having to work through it, because I feel like with marriage of convenience, sometimes in romance, it's fun, but I don't really see how they're going to be together going forward.
Yeah.
Once the story ends. With marriage of convenience, I think we get to see them work out everything and we see how they work well together.
Yeah.
And that's what I love about it.
It is so interesting to me in this context of the story, and also in the larger sense of the time period then and now, that you have women who are constantly having to negotiate a tiny morsel of power from men. And here's Cora with this big letter of amazing money power, but she still has to negotiate. She has to negotiate whether or not she's going to have children. And she has to negotiate whether or not she's going to be able to leave the marriage and be happy on her own if that's what she wants.
Not only does she have to negotiate if she can have children, but she doesn't know if she's actually going to get that concession.
No.
You know?
Yeah. So she's got this tiny little chance at power, and she still has to negotiate with men all the time. No wonder she writes feminist papers.
Under a pseudonym.
Yeah.
I mean, could you imagine? I would be writing too.
I would be pretty raging.
There's a quote that I put at the beginning of the book, which I was so shocked that I found. And it's from Susan B. Anthony. And it says, "Men have everything, most women nothing but what men give them. When women want anything, be it bread or a kind word, they must pay the price that men exact for it, and it is nearly always a pound of flesh." So I felt that was so powerful, and so it just encapsulated everything that Cora is having to go through. She has to negotiate with her father to even get her inheritance. Even then, she's not really totally sure he's going to follow through.
Yeah.
Then she has to negotiate with the Earl that she's planning to marry.
Yeah.
And even go so far, okay, if we have this many children, I don't want any more. Or if we had this and this is bad for my body, we're not going to have any more after that.
Yeah. And if you are if you are cruel to me, there's really not a lot I can do about it. Even in the very beginning, one of the things I like about Cora is how astute she is. Like when she's talking to her father, she takes the letter from his mother, her grandmother, out of the envelope, but holds onto the envelope because she's thinking he could just take this letter and chuck it in the fire and no one would be able to prove what I'm saying. But if I have the envelope, I can prove she did write me something. Like it's not enough proof, but she doesn't have to trust any of these people, but she has to negotiate with them. That is so hard.
And, she's used to that because she's the oldest of her sisters.
Yeah.
And her mom, Fanny, I love her. And this was the first book I wrote. I realized, oh gosh, I'm the same age as the mom.
Oops.
So she has a soft spot in my heart. But at the same time, she's irresponsible. I mean, she grew up without parents. She was an actress as soon as she could run away from the orphanage. And she's just a free spirit and has no idea how to raise children, but she's done her best. But, when Cora does negotiate with Leo for their marriage, Fanny doesn't show up because she doesn't even realize she's supposed to.
No. And she wouldn't have anything to add to the conversation anyway, except to be just embarrassing. And that's really interesting because the boundaries of class are so much more firm for the women than they are for the men. The smallest things give you away as not belonging because the rules are so opaque and they're so old and they don't even make sense half the time. And so you have some people who are trying to be dollar princesses who are trying to make connections. Like I know some of the more famous ones were like best friends with the Prince of Wales, probably a good position to be in, to be among his friend group. But then you have people like Fanny who don't even know that they should care about how they're coming across and how they're presenting, which means that Cora now has to navigate even more negotiation. Like, how do I further my own interests without alienating or hurting my mother and my sisters, even though my mother is going to probably harm my efforts to make the best of the situation that I'm in.
Right.
Poor Fanny. Bless her heart.
Cora had a lot riding on her shoulders for sure.
Yeah, she really does. So what are some of the things that drew you to this transactional marriage story? What led you into this story?
Well, I would say the Almina Wombwell story, how she was married and illegitimate. And there was this big to-do when I was reading about her, about where to hold the wedding breakfast. So, because she was illegitimate, so you can't hold it here, you can't hold it there. I just thought it was an interesting take, something I hadn't really delved into yet in these Gilded Age marriages. So that drew me. And I was also, at this point, researched a lot more with what was going on in Britain at the time, the politics of that. And that's how, so Leo is fighting for clean water for the working class towns. It's more than clean water, but like the trash taken out and things like that, because you would have piles of trash as tall as buildings in these towns because they built up the towns so fast. So the workers who work in the factory would have somewhere to live. And that's why you have the tenement buildings and you have the terraced houses that we see there now. But there was no thought to sanitation or anything. So that was an afterthought that came through. And it wasn't until the 1850s when Dr. Snow sort of physically proved, hey, water can get us sick.
Yeah.
Because there was an outbreak of, I think, cholera or something like that. It was linked to this one well. And he physically interviewed all the people, traced it to like 20 miles out and proved it was all from this one well. These people had gotten water. Sometimes they would pay to have water shipped to them because they'd grown up around this one well.
And it had a particular taste because it had cholera in it.
Exactly.
I think it was next to an animal rendering place or a factory or a cemetery, something super gross that you shouldn't be drinking.
It was linked to this woman who was like washing diapers in the open water there at the well.
Great. Sure. Awesome. Yeah.
So, yeah. Anyway, so he's fighting for clean water.
Mm-hmm.
for these people to have access to clean water. And what's so funny is that even though so the book is 1878, Dr. Snow proved this in the 1850s, you still had people saying, oh no, this isn't true.
Yeah.
It's caused by miasma, vapors in the air. And that continued on until, even though the bill he was working on was based on a real one, and it did pass like it does in the book, sorry, spoiler alert, later on, it's not until the 1890s that people really embraced that this is germs or something that happened that can spread in the water. And it's not because it wasn't proven, because Pasteur also proved it scientifically. It's just that it was cheaper to not believe that, because you had the landowners, the landlords, the politicians, they would all have to sort of bear the price of building this infrastructure. And so, again, this is something that we see happening today over and over. We prove something, but it's not convenient or it's not cheap enough to believe.
Yep.
So,
it happens right now. Right now, we've got people with mumps because they're like, no, vaccines don't work. No, we proved this. Let's not do polio. Yeah. Polio is bad.
Yeah.
It on the one hand, it's like, wow, like you said, humans are so similar and we're so very very similar across time periods. And yet we are so collectively boneheaded.
It's true. I mean, we can be. And it all comes down to, greed or this feeling of scarcity.
Yep. And that someone's going to take what you have and that you won't be as special and have the status that you think you should ought to have. It's greed and entitlement. And of course you can convince people, wow, these towns should have basic sanitary services and clean water because they're people and they should have those things. But it is probably a much more effective argument then and now to say, if you do these things, then worker productivity will increase. And you will make more money because you will have healthy people who aren't bathing in their own refuse. That's going to be a more effective argument. Even now, it's a more effective argument. Wow, we don't learn anything except
if
us romance readers.
Are healthy and make a livable wage.
Yeah, it's kind of shocking.
They might actually be more productive
and also generally happier. Like this is all. Oh, it's so basic. Mm-hmm. So do you have any transactional romances that you would want to recommend or marriage of convenience stories that you would want to recommend?
Okay, so I knew this question was coming and I actually had to think hard about it because I don't think we have as many as we used to.
No, we don't. It's true.
They used to be all over the place, but I think, in general, we have less historical romance now, sadly, with mass market sort of going away.
Yeah.
But in general, I just think we need more marriage of convenience romances. So the one I will always recommend because I love Lisa Kleypas is Devil in Winter, of course.
Yes.
And then Mimi Matthews, because I love her books and the history she puts in her books and the simmering tension. And even though I'm pretty sure all of her books are closed door. I know the ones that I've read are.
Yeah.
She still has that spice factor. Like you just see the longing between these people. The Belle of Belgrave Square.
Such sexy hand holding.
I know.
Incredible gestures with gloves. Oh, yes. Exactly. She's very good at it.
I know. I love her so much. A Caribbean Heiress in Paris by Adriana Herrera.
Oh, that is a very good example. Yeah.
I forgot that it was actually a marriage of convenience until I was going back through my bookshelves and I'm like, oh yes, it was, because they just had such good, it was also kind of enemies to lovers in the beginning because they meet and then later they decide to get married. So it's kind of got the best of both, I think. The Duchess Deal, of course, by Tessa Dare.
Yep.
And one that I remember, and it's contemporary, The Bride Test by Helen Hong.
That is sort of. Yes, that is absolutely true.
So those are my top recommendations.
Oh, those are good recommendations. What are you working on right now? Are you allowed to talk about it? If you're not allowed to talk about it, it's okay.
Right now I am working on book 2 in the series. I just got edits back, so that's going through edits right now. It's Eliza's book, so the younger sister. And it's interesting because also the hero is a little bit not a typical hero, which I'm finding with this series. I'm just trying to do stuff different. I always have to have a challenge with my books. Like I'm learning something, I'm doing something different. And so he's a little bit of a different hero for me too, just in a different way than Leo.
One of the things that I like about this story, and I'm presuming this is going to continue since you're writing about sisters, is how Cora and her sisters are honest about who they are and each of their flaws and their mother's flaws and the flaws with their biological father. They're aware of all of these people's flaws, but they're still going to treat each other as family. And there's an emphasis on like a very honest family in this series. Is that something you set out to do deliberately?
Yeah, well, it just felt very real to me because I mean, that's really what family is.
Yeah.
Even if you're close to your sister or your cousin or whatever, you're still going to have these things that bother you about them.
Oh, yeah.
These expectations that aren't met sometimes. So it just felt very real. And I was trying to be more authentic and show, this is also family. And sometimes you're not going to talk to each other for a couple months because somebody said something, but you can. And this is something I try with all of my books. One of the message I want is whatever your happily ever after is, whether it's you being single with a partner, multiple partners, whatever it is for you. Like you can get there, you can evolve to that space, and it comes from you. Whatever you're working on, you have to do that for yourself rather than depend on somebody else.
Yeah.
So that's sort of where that was from.
I also particularly love the eldest sister energy that Cora has.
Mm-hmm.
Like she even sees Leopold and her sister's like, oh, he is handsome. And she's like, would you want him? You can have him. I'll step back. It's fine. I can find some other guy. There's that guy with the spit in the corner of his mouth all the time. I could date him. It's fine. You want him? That's fine.
I could take one of them.
Yeah. She has such eldest sister energy, especially eldest sister of a not effective parenting mom.
Exactly. Because she's had to be the parent in many situations.
And
so
negotiator.
She wants everybody else to be happy.
Yeah. You want him? It's fine. I don't, it's fine. I don't need him. He's got twinkly eyes, but no, you can have him. It's fine. I was like, oh, Cora, as a fellow oldest sister, I get it. I get it. Now, I know you gave a bunch of recommendations, but I do always ask what people are reading. If there's anything that you're particularly enjoying that you would like to share, I would love to hear it.
Oh, gosh. Every time people ask me this, I'm like,
oh, yeah, me too.
I don't know what I'm reading.
Literally, my job is to recommend books, and somebody will ask me, and I'm like, what's a book? Is that a thing I should know about? I don't know what a book is.
So right now I'm reading 10 Things That Never Happened by Alexis Hall because I love Alexis Hall's book. It's just that very British voice.
Oh, yes. Very particular.
So that's what I'm reading right now. I also just finished The Lady He Lost by Faye Delacour. It's a historical romance. That's interesting to me. I read an early copy of this, but they were friends and then they became enemies and then they became lovers. So it's definitely a good friends to enemies to lovers, which I don't think we have enough of in historical romance. It's usually friends to lovers or enemies to lovers, but it's rare you can get both.
Yeah. And if you have friends to enemies to lovers, you have an enemy that knows how to press all your buttons, probably because they installed some of them because you've known each other for so long. They can just get you the way no one else can. A friendship falling out is brutal.
It just makes it all the sweeter when they finally do get together.
Yeah. And it's even more fiery when they go to Bone Town, basically.
And there's a pretty good grovel in this one, too.
Oh, good
from
grovel.
From the initial falling out.
Gorgeous cover, too. So where can people find you if you wish to be found? You don't have to be found if you don't want to.
So Instagram is where I love to hang out, and it's at Harper St. George, but I'm also on Facebook and Threads and a little bit Twitter, but I mainly updates only there. And my website, of course, harperstgeorge.com.
Thank you so much for doing this interview.
Thank you for having me. It was, like I said, a long-time listener, first-time caller.
And that brings us to the end of this week's episode. Thank you to Harper for joining me. And thank you to this wonderful YouTube video that I found that went over so many different dollar princesses. The video is from History Tea Time with Lindsay Holiday, and I will link to it in the show notes. And of course, never fear, I will have links to all of the books that we mentioned as well, should you too wish to take a dive into marriage of convenience and transactional marriage stories, which, as I mentioned, are among my favorites. As always, I end with a terrible joke, and this week is no exception. I love this joke. Did you know all garden gnomes have red hats? It's true. All garden gnomes have red hats. It's a little gnome fact. A little gnome fact. I'm just going to call things little gnome facts all the time. That is from Dad Says Jokes, and I am glad that Dad said that joke because that is very funny. Gnome facts. On behalf of everyone here, including Wilbur, who is snoring, and I'm really grateful that the mic is not picking it up, we wish you the very best of reading. Have a wonderful weekend, and we will see you back here next week. Smart Podcast Trashy Books is part of the Frolic Podcast Network. You can find more outstanding podcasts to subscribe to at frolic.media/podcasts. Little gnome fact.